Gun violence ripped through a wealthy Chicago suburb on Monday during a 4th of July parade. Unfortunately and sadly, leaving 6 innocent people dead, including a 76-year-old grandfather. A 22-year-old person of interest was taken into custody without incident. Meanwhile, body cam video was released over the weekend showing cops in Akron, Ohio, shooting an unarmed 25-year-old black man 60 times following a routine traffic stop. What do these two horrific tragedies say about policing policies, and the way suspects in this country are treated? And what, if anything, is the Supreme Court doing to perpetuate or to lessen the amount of gun violence that we see, including state-sanctioned gun violence? Experts weigh in, all coming up next.
Live from Los Angeles, this is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
The police detained a man they described as a person of interest in the shooting at the Highland Park, Illinois, 4th of July celebration, where 6 people were gunned down. After an 8-hour manhunt, the police arrested a 22-year-old white man. Police say he had climbed into a rooftop with a rifle and begun firing into a sea of families and lawn chairs where people were gathered celebrating Independence Day. And then several states over, protesters took to the streets all over the weekend after graphic body cam video of 8 police officers shooting 25-year-old unarmed Jayland Walker. After that body cam was released, press conference from the chief of police and local officials in the Akron community spoke about what we were about to witness on that body cam video. Very graphic video, and protesters have been in the streets since the video was released demanding justice for Mr. Walker. And in the meantime, the U.S. Supreme Court has made it easier for New Yorkers to openly carry guns and has basically limited states' rights to restrict who and under what circumstances can individuals have access to firearms. And although we've saw a bipartisan piece of legislation passed regarding gun safety, many say that piece of legislation did not go far enough to prevent the kind of tragedy that we saw on Independence Day in Highland Park, Illinois. Here to help us break down what we have witnessed over this weekend, this very violent weekend, is national law enforcement expert, former police chief, and former member of the Obama Commission on 21st Century Policing. He's also the author of In Defense of Public Service. My good friend is here this morning, Cedric Alexander. Good morning, Cedric.
Good morning.
It seems like I only talk with you when there's some horrific tragedy, and there have been so many of those over the last couple of months and just even over this last weekend. We're going to talk about, almost like a tale of two cities, right? So this 22-year-old white young man is arrested after police believe he was involved with the shooting of 6 innocent people at this 4th of July parade in Highland Park. And then we see this horrible, horrible video of Jayland Walker shot in Akron. Help us understand why Mr. Walker is dead after a routine traffic stop, and this 22-year-old white man is in custody. And someone joked on social media, although it's not funny, but this could have happened. They said police probably took him to McDonald's and, gave him his favorite meal before they even took him to the police station.
Well, it's unfortunate. And I will tell you, as a law enforcement official and being a person of color, being a black man, I certainly do understand the perception oftentimes our people in particular may have around this. I mean, we can go all the way back to the shooting there in South Carolina, where you had a number of people shot and killed in the church, and the suspect there, a young white male, was supposedly taken to Burger King and handled very, very differently. And then you come up as recent as the case in Buffalo, New York, where he had this self-proclaimed white supremacist went into the store just to kill people of color, and did, and walked out with the rifle still strapped on him, and was handled very differently. And then you have the incident, of course, in Grand Rapids, Michigan, where questions are being raised around there on a fundamental traffic stop, subject unarmed, gets shot in the back of the head, officer indicted. And you have these cases in which oftentimes, based on where you sit in society and what your experience is in America, you may have a different view of, and it raised these important questions. And I don't have the answer to that because I always see them very individually, and they get managed individually, and they get managed across 18,000 police departments very differently. So we can't.
I hear what you're saying, and you're right. These are individual cases, and
right.
We should not try to, extrapolate too much from any one case and draw some kind of pattern. But is there some bias that exists across these 18,000 police departments? That when a suspect is white, there's just a different trigger mechanism in the brain versus when a suspect is black. Because I know what you're saying, we shouldn't draw patterns, but it just feels like when there's a white suspect, there's some kind of effort to keep that person alive. And
we hear people say this. And not only do we hear blacks say it, we also hear whites that are saying the same thing as well, too. So this is not relegated to one group of people, blacks seeing that. It certainly do raise that question. Why is one group somehow seem to be treated differently in these types of situations that appears to be the least threatening end up dying at the hands of police? I don't have an answer to that. But I know for us at this very critical place that we live in this country now and how people feel about police, it just continues to drive that wedge and makes things very difficult and challenging for everybody to try to understand and make sense of. I can't make sense of it. But clearly we know that in our criminal justice system, we know in our judicial system, that systemic racism do exist. And I think it exists at different levels in different places in different parts of the country. And in some places, it's just hard to figure how something is going to end or resolve. But I get it. I understand it. But clearly it continues to raise an eyebrow for Americans as to why is one group end up treated one way in a mass killing type of situation, but in a traffic stop, young African-American men, oftentimes unarmed, end up dead.
Yeah, let's talk about that. This traffic stop, this Jayland Walker, man, this is, again, some unusual things happened in this case. There's a car chase, there's a foot chase, there's Mr. Walker getting out of the car, apparently in a ski mask and taking off. There's a gun that's found on the seat of his car. There's a photograph, at least, or maybe a video suggesting that a shot was fired from that gun before he exits that vehicle. So there's a whole lot going on in this case. But one thing, Cedric, that really annoyed me over the weekend, the police union. This case has 8 officers involved, 18, 20-minute body cam video, other video. And before any of that's unpacked, they come out, broad, unequivocal statement supporting the police officers. Everything they did was right. How could they even possibly know that? No one knows that.
Well, no one knows that.
That's horrible.
Right. No one knows that. And I agree with you 100%. But that's their membership. That's their dues paying membership. Those are the folks who represent them. And the reality of it is that's what they do. But here in that particular case, more specifically, the one thing that raises the greatest big concern for me and a question that needs to be answered, if he was a threat when he exited the passenger side of the vehicle, then why did you deploy tasers? If you felt that he was a threat, you don't deploy tasers. You go firearm. They deployed tasers, and then they went hot with firearm.
Let me walk you back a minute. I said, let's go over what the Supreme Court says. So we know that Tennessee v. Gardner case, the Supreme Court made it clear that basically you should not pursue use lethal weapon when a suspect is fleeing unless that suspect poses some risk of harm. So that's what
correct. That's correct.
Don't go chasing after people. Don't shoot people unless there's a reason to do that, because you can apprehend that person later. Supreme Court sets that out. So we know that's the legal standard. Then we know police departments have their own department standards. And when we've seen these cases like Derek Chauvin go to trial, there's the legal standard that has to be applied that's been set by the Supreme Court. And then we look at the policy by that police department. So if we start with Tennessee v. Gardner, do you think that Mr. Walker was a threat as he began to flee?
Well, here's the thing we have to keep in mind. I don't know that, from the images that we see. In all fairness, I don't. We see an image exit, clearly be him with what appeared to be a ski mask on. He exited, they deploy a taser, probably because they see him as running, trying to escape. But it doesn't.
Let me just tell you. So if you stop a car for a routine, your tail light is out, your plates are expired, and then so first of all, they try to stop him in his car. He takes off in his car. Should they have chased him in the car? Let's start there.
Yeah.
Under typical police policies, do you chase a moving vehicle?
You chase a moving vehicle in most cities, most policies. We do not engage in a chase unless it's one of the 7 deadly sins, right? Rape, robbery, murder, etc. So
if I'm stopping you for a taillight and you take off,
we're not going to get involved in a chase. Many departments are not going to get involved in a chase. It is a misdemeanor. It's too much risk involved through the roadways, endangering the lives of people out there, right? And many departments will not pursue. Now, in this particular case, they did. I don't know if they were operating on any other information, such as maybe someone who has been robbing stores in the area at that time of night, driving that type of vehicle. I don't know what intelligence
information. Perhaps the chase was justified, but in a typical, I try to stop you for a minor traffic or vehicle infraction.
No.
You take off.
No.
You just gone.
You just
license and deal with let the department back at the station deal with you.
Right. And I'll meet you at the house after I've impounded your car.
Okay,
right.
So we're gonna give them the benefit of the doubt. Like you said, maybe they got some information about a
maybe they had some information we're not privy to. Right.
Now, when, based on what you've been able to see, did they perceive that he fired a gun from the vehicle?
Well, we saw that flash, right? That was indicated on the video we seen. A lot of that still has to be understood. Did he fire a shot at them? Did he fire a shot out the window? Did the gun go off accidentally? We don't know. I still think a lot's to be determined. But it certainly does up the ante now in terms of how I'm going to approach that vehicle. If I see and feel that you have fired a shot, and I can only anticipate if I'm behind you, was that directed as me, right? As the pursuing officer. Mm-hmm. So when he took off running here again.
Well, let me ask you this. So if I'm chasing behind you in a car and I perceive that a shot was fired either at me or out the window, the chief of police says that changed the whole dynamic of encounter. Do you agree with that?
At the point he supposedly fired the weapon, correct?
Yes. He said now this becomes a public safety situation.
He's absolutely right. Okay. Absolutely. Because once I see the flash, if I'm behind you and it appears you fired a weapon, I hear the sound or see the flash, yes, that becomes a public threat and you're still fleeing away from me. Okay. He did that in this case. These officers were well within their right. The problem in here becomes...
Okay, now I'm just trying to take you frame by frame. So they see the shot, he stops at some point.
Right.
He then exits the vehicle. What do they do? What should the police do then? Once he exits, as you said, that passenger side of his vehicle would...
They ask him to stop, to freeze, to get on the ground. Police, stop. he should obey that command without question, right? They're giving him a direct command under those circumstances. He continued to flee. They followed behind.
Should they now? We talked about them following him in the car. Once they said, stop, get on the ground, he refuses and he takes off on feet. Yeah. Should they have pursued him on feet?
Yes, absolutely. I support that. Yes, they should have.
Because you said, well, what's the exigent circumstance now that Tennessee would allow, Garner would allow you to?
I cannot, and I'm not an attorney here. That would fall more with you. I'm not an attorney here.
Well, I'm saying, apparently you think it's the flash from the vehicle that was a gun.
That appeared to have been a gun. That certainly has upped the ante here, right? It appears he's fired a weapon. I've heard the shot. I've seen the muzzle flash. He continues. He jumps out. He's running away from the vehicle. I don't know whether he still has this weapon in his hand or not, correct? But the point of it is he jumps out. He takes off running. Yes, I have the authority to continue and the public responsibility to continue with that pursuit. Because clearly he's trying to get away. I think we have more than enough probable cause here to pursue him at this point, right? Based on what we're seeing in what we're experiencing.
The issue is taser now. So at what point do they try to tase him?
It appears that when he was running, tasers were deployed. Mm-hmm. Now, the reason why they used tasers to deploy merely could be that was a resistance. And you can deploy taser doing a passive resistance. He's attempting to get away from them. And the tasers did not deploy. The questions I have, if you use taser and you feel that he was an imminent threat, how did you use a taser and then so quickly go to gun?
Well, let me tell you what I have heard from the police officer. The chief says that they've been able to freeze frame some of the video. They have some still photos. And some of these officers have said that at some point he stops, turns towards the officers and takes a shooting position, stands, and appears to be pointing. We know it's not a gun because he didn't have a gun, but what they believe to be a weapon at them, which in their minds caused them to believe they were in imminent danger, i.e. they then start firing their guns.
Well, that's going to be the challenge right there. They're going to have to be able to clearly articulate, and utilizing all the physical evidence and those statements on that scene, everything is going to have to line up to that. And we weren't there. I wasn't there. So when it got to that tense of a moment, under those particular set of circumstances, only they can be the ones who clearly be able to articulate why they took the action that they did. And if they can, that's one thing. If they can't, there could be some serious implications here, but we don't know. And I think the thing about these types of events is that, and I'm going to tell you, I really like the way the police chief has handled this. He's been upfront. He's been forthright as best that he can around what he knows. And this investigation has been turned over to an outside entity, I think, to the state police there in Ohio, which is where it needs to be.
So but I think it's good. Yes. And I agree with you that he came for, well, one, there's a city ordinance. So let's just say he was complying with the city ordinance that required them to release body cam within 7 days. I think what has the community so upset about this case is the issues of proportionality. Mm-hmm. Why 8 cops and why 60 bullets? And at one point you could hear one of the cops saying, ceasefire, ceasefire, 3 times. And there are allegations that shots continue to be, dislodged or fired at Mr. Walker, even when he's on the ground, clearly no longer a threat. Why? Under what circumstances can you think of, Cedric, where it would take 60 shots at an individual, some of which happened while he's on the ground? And why would 8 officers, and I think also one of my producers said there's some allegations that some officers joined while others were still firing, like a first set of their firing and somebody else comes up and they just start firing. Help us understand.
I can't help you understand that. And I mean, because it sounds reckless on the surface, right? So I can't help nobody understand that because it truly sounds reckless on the surface. Yeah. But these are the questions they're going to have to answer. Each one of those officers that fired those weapons that particular night. That is, those are questions they're going to have to be able to respond to under oath when statements are made. And this investigation continues because I think the American people want to know, people in that community and family certainly wants to know. But I cannot for the life of me, and nor am I going to try to explain what happened out there. But I certainly do understand why people would be so outraged at that type of behavior on that particular night in that shooting. So, and the family in that community deserve answers. We're public servants and we have a duty to protect. And everybody know policing is a tough job. Everybody understand that. Everybody gets it. But people are asking for accountability when these types of events and shootings takes place. And especially when now that we have the technology to be able to ourselves ask questions that have never been asked before. We got to be able to answer these questions now. And I, just like the rest of the public out here, and this like the chief of police, we want to know what was going through your mind, where was the threat, and what was the reason for the number of people engaged in this, officers, and the number of shots being fired. I can't answer that for them.
And we know the Graham v. Connor standard, again, allows police to use lethal force, and they're going to be judged by the reasonableness of what was happening, their perception at that time, recognizing that these decisions often have to be made in split seconds, and it's not about looking back and trying to figure out from a 2020 lens. But the police chief made it pretty clear, Cedric, and this is the law. Each and every one of those shots that were fired has to be
they got to be accounted for.
Has to be accounted for.
You got to be accounted for.
Show the public and maybe a jury that the threat continued, not just with shot 10, but then when you got to shot 50, that this man is somehow still a threat.
Right.
That seems unlikely, but, I'm not going to do what I accuse the police union of doing, which is jumping out there too soon before an investigation has told us anything. But I think just, our common sense response is, my God.
And also think too, we should never underestimate the logic of the general public in terms of what they're seeing. They see the same thing I see. They see the same thing you see. And they raise the same level of questions. And if I was police chief again, I would be asking the same question that chief is asking. What was the reason for this over a number of shots being fired at an individual, even if you felt he was a threat? How did it get to that point? And if he allegedly went down, why were shots still being fired? So people are going to have a bunch of different opinions and thoughts about that. Right. But I think the reality of it is I want to see what this investigation is going to clearly reveal to us, which will put it in some perspective. But trying to tell something any different to the family and friends and folks in that community, other than the fact that something here horribly went wrong, they deserve answers. And I think any of us that are chiefs across this country and police officers across this country, we want those families to find out what happened.
So, Cedric, we're big crime drama enthusiasts on this show, and we were having this conversation in our production meeting. There's this episode in Chicago PD where officers do kind of what happened in this case with Mr. Walker, where you have a group of officers who fired just this, barrage of bullets at a suspect, even once the person is down and he's no longer a threat. And on the show, they say, well, this is what officers do to protect each other. So if I fire 10, you fire 10, and shots are fired even after the person is dead, it makes it harder for the medical examiner to determine which shot actually killed the person and somehow, kind of muddies the waters in a way that you can't really tell who the actual shooter was. Is that something, I'm sure it's not trained or taught to police officers, but is that something that, happens?
I've never heard of that. I've never heard of that. Yeah, I mean,
It's all drama. It's all Dick Wolf and Chicago people.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I've never heard of anything as such as that at all. I can't go
It's
there.
pretty sinister, and it would be disturbing, beyond disturbing, if that were true. I'm glad to hear that that's.
But I think we also have to remember, when considering this climate we're in, mm-hmm. and considering the fact when people watch these dramatic episodes on television, it is not difficult to understand why people would not think that these kinds of things happen in real life, right?
Yeah.
And that's the importance of having these independent investigations that can report with a level of integrity and thoroughness, and in a timely manner, such as what you saw in Grand Rapids. That was very timely. They went in, they did their investigation, they came back with their results and their findings, I should say, mm-hmm. and the state did their part. And I think this has happened here too, because when you start dragging these out into 6-7 months a year, and you're not talking to the public, and then you give your determination, such a Breonna Taylor case and the work they did up there at the Attorney General's office in the state of Kentucky, which I think was a travesty to that community. But nevertheless, that's another story. Because you never talked to the people, you never told them what you were doing and how the investigations was moving along. And then whatever your finding may happen to be, it leaves room for so much suspiciousness.
Well, one thing we have seen, Cedric, over the last 10 years, this notion that it's difficult to prosecute and convict police officers, although it still obviously is an issue in our judicial system. But we are seeing more police officers held accountable who are being indicted. And in many cases, we saw in the case of Walter Scott, that police officer got 20 years. He's serving 20 mm-hmm. years, second-degree murder for chasing Walter Scott and shooting Walter Scott. So there are cases now that we can point to where there are officers being indicted and being held accountable. So this notion that police are above the law is starting to change. It's slow. Not nearly as many officers, I think, have been indicted that need to be indicted in some of these cases. But I can remember, and I'm sure you can remember, a time when there were hardly any police indictments.
Yeah, but we always have to remember, too, we got to look at each case individually when it does occur. Each case has to be looked at individually. But I think it's also important to note here, too, there are a lot of good officers out there that are now standing up saying that is wrong. And I'm not getting behind that. And this is exactly what I saw happen. You understand what I'm saying? That's hugely important, too.
No, absolutely. And we saw that in the case of Derek Chauvin. We saw his own chief get up and say, this is not the way we teach policing.
Yeah, that was fine, but that was the chief. I'm talking about the officers that's out there on the streets with them when these events occur. Yeah. It's easy for me to say that as a chief, but the officer being there next to you, I got to be able to say, you know what? Hey, Areva, what you did is wrong. Yeah. I'm not supporting that. And when they ask me for my story, I'm going to only give the facts.
Yeah. No, you're right. But I don't think we should discount those chiefs, Cedric, because we've seen a lot of chiefs do like.
I'm not discounting chiefs, but it's easy. I get that. But the point of it is, my statement is not going to matter in the case. It's the statement of the witness officers who are on those scenes.
Well, we're going to see what this guy who kept yelling ceasefire, he's going to be an important witness in this, because obviously he at some point perceived the threat to have been arrested, or to know, or he perceived Mr. Walker to no longer be a threat, and was telling everyone, cut it out, stop.
Right.
And he's going to be a very critical witness. Thank you so much, Cedric. Always good to see you.
Good seeing you.
Break this down. We're going to be following this, and we'll see how quickly this independent law enforcement agency comes back with its findings with regards to what happened with Mr. Walker.
Well, we'll see you on the other side of this. All right.
Absolutely. Now, my next guests are activists who've been in the streets in many cities across this country, advocating for changes to the way this country polices, particularly in communities of color. Michelle Gross is here. She's a co-founder and president of Community United Against Police Brutality. And Tashira Garway is here. She's the founder of Family Supporting Families Against Police Violence. Good morning and welcome, ladies. Just ask you, Tashira, your reaction when you saw that police body cam video released of Mr. Walker being shot, by those 8 cops.
Well, being that I lost a loved one, Justin Tigan, in a lot of the same way that Jalen was killed, there was, in Justin's case, there was a car pursuit, and then there was a pursuit on foot. And ultimately, he ended up dead just the same way as Jalen did. And so it was very re-traumatizing to watch this video. And I just believe that injustice done anywhere is an injustice done everywhere. So although we are in the state of Minnesota, just seeing that coverage happen all over was re-traumatizing. It reminded me of my own loss, Justin Tigan. And it's sad. And I think that it was unnecessary what they did. It was uncalled for them to shoot that many times. I've been through a training because I'm a licensed gun holder, and you are not supposed to shoot or kill unless your life is in imminent danger. I do not believe that someone that's running away from you, that your life is in imminent danger. They're running away. So they're afraid or something of that nature. In addition to that, we have people that actually go and kill people, as you guys were talking about, in grocery stores and all kinds of stuff, and they walk out alive when they are white. And so we see what's going on. This doesn't take a rocket scientist. We know what's going on. The white privilege, we got to call it out for what it is and not sugarcoat it. And when it comes to Black, brown, and indigenous bodies, we're looked at already as a threat. We have Philando Castile, who his anniversary is tomorrow. And the reason Philando is dead here in the state of Minnesota is because he said he had a weapon that he was legally licensed to carry, and he was shot to death. That's because we're already looked at as a threat when you wear this skin color. And so, and white men they're the ones that are going around killing people and walking away unharmed. Right. So we have to start calling this stuff out for what it is and not sugarcoat it and just say, hey, this is what we see. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to see what's going on. White supremacy and white privilege.
Yeah. Michelle, no doubt what Tashira says is absolutely correct. We've seen too many examples of white suspects, murderers.
Yes.
We don't know if it's true, but allegedly Dylan Roof was taken to a fast food restaurant before he was taken into custody. Do you think it changes anything in this situation, the fact that there could have been a perception on by these police officers in Akron that a gun had been fired? That's going to be a point of contention. Family lawyers saying that there's no evidence that a gun was fired. We know the police chief made a big deal out of the fact that a gun was found in the car, a casing was found, there was this muzzle, what they believe to be a flashlight. How significant do you think that is in terms of perhaps giving more leeway to these officers to engage in the conduct that they did?
Well, thank you for asking. The reality is this. The man that shot everybody, in Highland Park, he did have a gun. The man that shot people at the grocery store, he had a gun, but he was white. Both of them were white. And I will never forget seeing this arrest of this gentleman, Cremo, I think his last name is, that did the shooting or is suspected of doing the shooting in Highland Park. When they arrested him, they were like, sir, if you would please get on your hands and knees, and all of this courtesy stuff with a guy that still has a gun. It's appalling to me. And, same with the grocery store and things like that. I'm a paralegal in my paid work outside of Communities United Against Police Brutality. And in that work, I've worked on a number of cases where, for example, we had a client who was an African-American woman. She was pulled over for a seatbelt violation. And she did not have a weapon with her. But when she went to get her driver's license, the officer saw her conceal and carry permit in her wallet. She didn't have her weapon with her. He lost his mind. He's juggling a gun in her face, like this, like Barney Fife. She thought she was the next Philando Castile, and so it's because she's an African-American woman. It's as if, in a gun crazy society that we have here, it's anathema for people of color to have guns. And just the possibility that a person of color might have a gun seems to be enough for police to get away with murdering people. And I'm truly appalled with what I saw in that video. With Mr. Walker, I'm sick to my core by it. Frankly, I could barely look at that video. Just the overkill, but the kill at all was to me unnecessary.
But it's very traumatizing for all of us, I think, to watch these videos. Tashara, you're in Minnesota. You were in Minneapolis after George Floyd was murdered almost 2+ years ago. You were part of the protest. You were leading protests yourself. As you said, you lost a loved one to police violence. So you've been a part of this movement for a while. What is changing, if anything? I know you're talking to elected officials. You're talking to those folks in positions of power. Are you feeling like we're making any progress?
No, I'm not. I feel like we're falling on deaf ears. I feel like the only time that there was some type of progression towards change or real talk and seemingly action towards change is when the riots happened and when buildings went on fire. Might I add that it was not the Black Lives Matter movement or our movement that were putting those buildings on fire. It was a lot of white supremacists that were doing this stuff, and even some police officers that were engaging in that activity as well. But it seemed as if that was the only time there was the urgency for change. Otherwise, now that I guess they think that things kind of have simmered down from the George Floyd case and the Chauvin's trial, there's not this urgency. So Michelle as well, we're in a lot of meetings with those legislators, with people that can change the laws, the rules that have allowed this stuff to happen. Because as Michelle has data on, we have over 470 murders at the hands of law enforcement here in the state of Minnesota alone since the year 2000. So almost 500 bodies of Black and Indigenous and minority people in this amount of time. And yet there's little to no accountability because we got Derek Chauvin off the street and maybe a few of the officers that was with him, and then Kim Potter for just a year and a half. Remember, she only got crumbs in time. And so because we got those officers, I'm thinking that it's the feeling that I get is that we should just be satisfied with that. But how, when all of these other families are out here suffering from the loss? I just told you almost 500. And so when we are meeting with these legislators and trying to fight for change, we're falling on deaf ears. And it's sad because the people's backs are up against the wall. And unless we change the rules, which is the laws that have allowed this, we're going to be back at square one. And I'm really afraid of another backlash from the community happening. It may take that one last killing, but right now the police don't have a reason to stop because there's no rules that have changed to make them stop.
Right. You raise a good point, Michelle. Can you tell us what are the top 2 or 3 things that you guys have been working on as activists and advocates? What rule changes or law changes are you trying to push through your state legislature?
We've had a package of bills at the legislature for quite a long time now, trying to end things like no-knock warrants. We want to end qualified immunity. We were able to get a bill passed that requires 911 call centers to refer mental health crisis calls to mental health crisis responders. And that's been a good thing because 50% of the people that get killed by police are in the throes of a mental health crisis at the time. So we do want to try to lessen the impact, of policing on mental illness. But we have many other things that we need to get done. And Tashira has it exactly right. We go to the legislature and it's as if the murder of George Floyd never even happened. We haven't had enough change in the city or the state to prevent another George Floyd type incident from occurring. And it's because the police have too damn much power, bluntly. They've got police lobbies that, for some reason the legislature feels beholden to. And all the police have to say is, oh, you can't get rid of no-knock warrants. We need that tool. Well, they don't need the tool. We've shown it's bogus, but they still give the law enforcement way too much room to do whatever they want to do. And it's destructive to the community. It gives law enforcement too much power over our society. And it's just wrong. And you see this, nobody wants to look like they're against law enforcement or whatever nonsense. And what we end up having is unaccountable cops who do whatever they feel like doing, and the community suffers.
Yeah, to sure. There was a big push after George Floyd, when there was a lot of conversations about defund the police, to really try to dismantle some of the power structure that these police unions have. And again, that's why I brought that up with Cedric. Before the investigation even began, the police union in Akron came out with this strong statement supporting the police officers. Now, they may get to that in 30 days or 60 days, but to say that on day one, when that body cam video, so either you know something that we don't know, so that means there's been a lack of transparency, or you know nothing, and you're just making a blanket, support statement for these officers. And we're seeing that in Los Angeles. There's this big mayoral race happening here in November, and our police union spent about $4 to $5 million in support of a candidate whose plan is to further militarize the LA Police Department by adding 1,500 police officers. So, of course, the police union is in favor of the guy, Rick Caruso, who wants to add more members to the police department because that's more dues to the police union, which means more power for the union. So are there any conversations happening where you are about how do we take away some of that power that these police unions have? Because they are so powerful.
Yes, I want to say that shows you right there that they're committed to their officers, whether they have the full story or whether they only have half of the story. Their main objective, that shows you right there. See, when I say the proof is in the pudding in all of this, they're proving everything, because without even knowing the whole story, they got their back. They got their back right off the bat. They don't have to know everything. They just know that they got their back no matter what, whether they were right or wrong. Yeah. Okay. And this is why we have officers out there repeating this stuff over and over and over again. And you probably look at some of these officers' backgrounds, and Lord knows what, who they've killed prior to, but we are having conversations in the community about having communities and people at the table to make the decisions. Because like Michelle just said, we have police or ex-police that are in the Capitol making the laws, making the decisions. So it's all surrounded around police. It's like, no wonder there's no change, because the police are policing, and then some of them are legislators. You see what I'm saying? So we need more community voices, and we are having those. That's what we're fighting for. We're fighting to have more community voices at the table, because if you don't have the voices of the community who have to live with these decisions that are being made, we have people making decisions for our inner community that live out in the suburbs, that live far out in Minnesota, and they make decisions for North Minneapolis. It doesn't make any sense, and that's why we can't get any change.
Yeah, and Michelle, finally, I'll ask you that this whole defund the police, there was this big movement after George Floyd. There was a lot of debate about what defund meant. Some people meant moving monies away from the police budget, not all of their budget, but some of their budget, to mental health, to community services. For others, it meant something even more radical. Where is that movement in your mind, particularly in your community? Are there people who still want to either, completely dismantle police departments, or are there activists that want to still see more of their budget cut and reallocated?
Well, the movement for police accountability is a broad movement, and we have people with a lot of different positions. I think we're situated right now where we need to be, which is to push for expanding the response network so that, when 911 gets a call, they don't just have fire, police, ambulance. We need mental health responders. We need social service responders. There's no reason in the world that police ought to be ever addressing things like homelessness. They're not equipped for it. They're the inappropriate responders. The results are never good because it criminalizes people. So we want to make sure that we're, creating those expanded response networks so that there are other alternatives. I want to just go back for a second, though, to that question that you raised about the unions. This has been the role of the police union in Minnesota, all the police unions, but in Minneapolis in particular, since forever. The first thing they do is look to vilify the person that was killed in some fashion. I mean, if they have to go back to their second grade spelling test that they flunked, they'll do it. This young man, Mr. Walker, seems to have no record for them to pull on, to be able to vilify him in any real way. And he was just doing a job. He was driving an Uber driver, which is what so many young people are doing these days to be able to make a living. And, but this is what we see. Even after the murder of George Floyd, while some of us are looking at the Darnella Frazier video showing him being murdered, at the same time, the police public spokesperson is saying, we had an incident with a man and during his arrest, he died from a medical emergency. And then the police union came right behind it and layered on top of that with all kinds of bad background about George Floyd and all of this kind of stuff, never mentioning that Derek Chauvin had been involved in 4 prior deadly force incidents before he killed George Floyd, not ever mentioning the 26 complaints against Derek Chauvin that the city never disciplined prior to him killing George Floyd. So you see, it's kind of a very stilted, stacked, media, because it's driven by the kind of public relations stuff that the police do, as well as the police federation.
Well, I want to thank you and Tashura, Michelle, for the work that you all continue to do, because obviously the activists, our voices, the voices of the community, is so important on these issues. We're going to be watching to see what happens to those officers in Mr. Walker's case in Akron, but clearly there's still so much work to be done. And it's kind of like these mass shootings. We know it's going to happen again. It's just a question of what day and in what community. And even though there have been some changes made with the movement that has happened after George Floyd, just doesn't seem like nearly enough. And every time one of these stories of an unarmed Black man shot and killed by police, at some point, I don't even know what to say anymore. We're lost for words. The violence in this country, both state sanctioned by police and then by, lunatics like this guy that kills these 6 innocent people going to a parade and what some people thought was one of the safest communities in this country. So much more to be done on this issue. Thank you so much. Always good to see you, my friend Tashura, and thanks, Michelle.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank
Dr. Marjolaine Armstrong is with us today. She's a law professor at Santa Clara University School of Law. And we can't really have this conversation about guns and all this violence, Professor Armstrong, without talking about Gruen and the recent Supreme Court decision basically saying to New York, you can't prevent people from carrying guns openly, looking back at some historical reference in the Constitution and using that as a basis for stripping New York of its ability to pass sensible gun laws. Help us understand, is the court helping or hurting this fight in this country against all this gun violence?
Well, the court's definitely hurting the fight against gun violence because it said that the state of New York couldn't require people to have a justification, to prove a justification for needing to carry an open carry permit. And so it was just the state asking, why do you need a permit? And the court said they shouldn't even have to answer that question. So the protection of guns and the right to carry guns by this court is going, it's so extreme. No court has ever read the Second Amendment in this particular way. the court looked at regulations that existed around the time of the Second Amendment, regulations that were enacted after the Second Amendment. And some jurisdictions required people to put down a bond, a surety, if they possessed a gun. That might be something we should think about, since the Supreme Court has cited this particular law as something that existed at the time, though the way that the court prioritizes this right to bear arms is really not that contextual, even though it keeps referring to what the rules were at the time of the Second Amendment. The language of the Second Amendment is a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. But one of the reasons that this militia protection was in the Constitution was because people had to serve in militias, and the militias were primarily organized for catching fugitive slaves or suppressing slave revolts, or the militias were for fighting Native Americans. And so that was a time when people were required in their communities to serve in these militias in order to protect the community from these threats that don't exist anymore. So without referring to the fact that the reason that the amendment is there was to allow states to be able to gather these militias, and it does say well-regulated. And there's arguments that well-regulated just means well-organized, but the word regulate is used elsewhere in the Constitution in the power of Congress to regulate commerce. So clearly there was an understanding that regulation meant making laws.
Yeah, Professor, I just, it's so difficult to understand with this court, this activist court, that any challenge to individuals' rights with respect to guns, will be upheld, because even though we saw this bipartisan piece of legislation, gun legislation passed and signed, hasn't gotten nearly enough attention because it's been overshadowed by these mass murders and the activists on the Supreme Court on so many other areas like the climate and obviously reproductive rights. Can you envision, even if the Congress and Senate were able to come together and pass a more comprehensive gun safety bill that would include more extensive universal background checks, would outlaw the use of these rifles by individuals who are under the age of 21, that would even withstand scrutiny at this Supreme Court that's seated at this moment?
Well, certainly the Congress would have to be very careful in how it created or how the specifics of the law. Congress has the power to regulate interstate commerce. They could possibly ban the sale of these because it's articles in interstate commerce. And generally, the Supreme Court has a low standard of review for acts that are under the commerce power, as long as those acts address a subject that's commercial in nature, about movements of goods in interstate commerce. So that might be one approach that the court could take, because that the Senate could take, because there is a clear right to regulate commerce. Would the right be subject to a higher level of scrutiny if it involved guns? I don't know how long this court is going to be around in this particular configuration, but one of the things that this court has done has been to undermine precedent, which means that any of the decisions that they make can be undermined by the next configuration of the court, because they've just been so reckless, I think, in saying that previous decisions don't have to be followed.
Yeah, that's really scary. And we know that Justice Thomas, in his concurring opinion in the Dobbs case, which overturned Roe v. Wade, also kind of foreshadows for us other decisions, as you said, that were decided by that court that he said should be reconsidered, and suggested that they might not only be reconsidered, but perhaps even overturned. And so
Contraception, same-sex marriage, the right to engage in sexual relations with people of the same sex without being subject to criminal punishment. All of those things were mentioned by Thomas.
yeah, all very scary, because it would take this country back to a period, where rights that we have enjoyed have been taken away from us, or would be taken away from us. Just quickly on this police union issue that has come up in this Walker case. Like I said, it's an issue in the Los Angeles mayor's race that's coming up in November. Do you see any challenges that could be made to these unions that could help dismantle some of the power? Because when we looked at how we were trying to reshape our police departments following the George Floyd murder, the unions were a big focal point, because they were in many ways preventing the records, as we saw the activists talk about, the prior records of complaints against officers. They often fight to keep those out of the public view. They often fight to keep police officers on the job who've had prior incidents where perhaps they are not fit to serve, but they are protected by the union. Can you envision any kind of legal challenge that would strip the union? And I'm pro-union, and you probably are too. Most of us have family members that are members of unions, but the police union seems to have a level of power unlike the union for healthcare workers or the union for teachers. So help us understand what, if anything, could be done to not strip police officers of their rights to be represented in collective bargaining by unions, but this due amount of, or this oversized amount of power that they seem to have, particularly around these police shooting cases.
Well, the unions are really powerful because they have a tremendous amount of political impact. And so when you have people running for local office, getting the support of the police, which is often expressed through the police union, is terribly important. But there's been a fair amount of lessening of union protections over the last 20 years. And there are things like right to work laws, which don't allow unions to require the employees to be in the union. However, this is applying to other types of unions, like government workers, for example, and not this really political entity, this politically powerful police union. And the attorney, John Burris, has said the police unions are one of the greatest barriers to being able to address police brutality. So there really is a problem. There are protections in terms of the First Amendment as far as what the unions specifically say, but other unions have been undermined. They've just escaped because of their political power, influence.
Yeah, got to leave it there, but I think John is right. And we see that happening so often. Again, not being anti-union, because I don't want to give that impression at all. I'm actually pro-union, but these unions, at least these police unions, have this power over police, and police, as you said, they have this oversized power as it relates to elected officials. And we know elected officials, mayors appoint police chiefs in most jurisdictions, and on police chiefs and those unions have a great deal of power over who's going to be the mayor in that city because of their ability to pour millions of dollars into campaigns. A lot going on. Thank you so much. Always good to have your insight, Professor Armstrong.
You're welcome. Hard issues.
I want to thank all of my guests today. These shows are not fun because we're talking about the lives of people, real people whether it's that 75, 76-year-old grandfather who was shot because he goes to a parade in Highland Park, Illinois, or whether it's young Mr. Walker who jumps out of his car and runs. We don't know why he ran. I remember a case in 2016 in Massachusetts. Massachusetts Supreme Court says, look, Black men run from police because they are rightfully afraid because of the history of police violence against Black men. And that Supreme Court in Massachusetts recognized that a running Black man or Black man that's running from the police should not automatically make that person a danger or a threat, but police have to recognize the history of trauma and the history of racial profiling and brutality that Black men have suffered at the hands of police officers. And people, when I go on CNN, and I've been on TV all weekend talking about Mr. Walker's case, people often write to me and says, well, Areva, all he had to do was stop. Or why don't people, and they mean Black people when they say people, just stop and do what the police tell them to do? Well, the answer to that is it would be real easy to do that if you trusted the police to protect rather than to take your life. And if you are a Black man, there are too many examples throughout history where that's not the case. The police are not there to protect and to serve you. They are there with their implicit biases, their prejudices, and their sense that your life does not matter. So people that want me to answer to them, and I rarely do because you don't have a right to demand that I answer, but I want to share this answer with you now. There's good reason for Black men to run from police. And as much as we try to teach kids to be respectful of police, we also have to teach police to be respectful of the Black community. It's a two-way street. If police want Black men to trust them, they have to act in a trustworthy fashion. And to do that means that routine traffic stops, whether it's Dante Wright, Philando Castile, as Tashara reminded us, it's coming up on the anniversary of his death, or now Jayland Walker. Routine traffic stops should not end in the murder of a Black person, a white person, or any person for that matter. And Jayland Walker's death has already been ruled a homicide by the authorities in Akron, Ohio. And you just shouldn't die because your tail light is out or your license plate is expired. And we don't see white people dying when they get stopped by the police for routine traffic stops. So as Tashara said, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure it out. We have a policing system in this country that favors and values white lives over Black lives. And just my words to live by. I am not anti-police. No way. Not anti-police, but I am unequivocally anti-police brutality. Be safe out there. Remember, we're all in this together.